Hi, I'm Rebecca Lucero, and our lecture today is going to be on sex addiction and love addiction. First, we're going to discuss sex addiction in depth, and then we'll talk more about love addiction at the end of the lecture. So we're just going to go over some facts and talk about what sex addiction looks like, and then also how it affects the family and relationships. In the mid 80s, Patrick Carnes, who is probably one of the most famous authors who's written on sex addiction, he wrote a book called Out of the Shadows: Understanding Sexual Addiction. He wrote that he estimated that 8% of men and 3% of women were sexually addicted. And then more recently, the National Council on Sexual Addiction Compulsivity, now the Society for Advancement of Sexual Health, supported these statistics by suggesting that 6 to 8% of Americans are sex addicts, approximately 16 to 22 million people. So quite a few people deal with this addiction. And in my line of work, in my own private practice, I have seen several people who have struggled with sexual addiction. I would say that I have two people that I would classify as sexual addiction, and then two, more than that, quite a few, probably at least 10 other individuals that have struggled with pornography addiction. So kind of limited to pornography, but other people who I've seen have dealt with other sexual behaviors or deviancy, such as seeing prostitutes, Craigslist ads, and other types of dangerous or risky behaviors. So it is fairly common. So just be aware that it affects quite a few people. So what is sex addiction? We have some statements here that kind of characterize what that would look like for a person. And so it describes those who engage in persistent and escalating patterns of sexual behavior, acting out despite increasingly negative consequences to self and others. Patrick Carnes also draws a parallel with alcohol or mood-altering drugs. Like alcohol, the relationship with the mood-altering behavior becomes more important than family and friends. The sexual addict's relationship with the mood-altering experience becomes central to his or her life, right? And this is why we start to see that it looks like an addiction, because it becomes the most important thing, more important than any negative consequences, any relationships, and even the person themselves. I think that sometimes people might think, sex addiction a real thing? That just sounds like maybe somebody has high sex drive, or maybe they're a little kinky. But I think, the distinguishing factor is that it's constantly escalating sexual behavior, and that there will be negative consequences, and the person is not responding to those negative consequences. Obviously, the sexual drive for each person may be different. People's preferences or taste for different kind of sexual behaviors will be different, but most people's do not continually escalate. They're not continually seeking a high. They will still enjoy things that they used to enjoy. So there's some pretty stark differences that you would be able to recognize, especially as a clinician, that someone may have a sexual addiction versus somebody who's just very sexually active or curious. It's a pattern of sexual behavior which is consistently uncontrollable and is continued in spite of significant social impairment and harmful consequences. The addict's relationship with a mood-altering experience becomes central to his or her life. Also, the relationship is with sex, not with people. So we see more and more that it becomes focused on the actual sex or the sexual acts. It can be commonly misunderstood as to be perverse or devious, and that's what it would appear to be from the outside. But if you actually talk to somebody with sexual addiction, you will find that it's very compulsive. It's something that's done just to feel normal. It's often used to manage anxiety or difficult emotions. It can be hard for somebody from the outside to understand how that person experiences sexuality, and this can be something that's very confusing for partners when they discover that someone has a sexual addiction, because sex can be something that is very relationship based, and is motivated by love or other kinds of feelings, as where for this person it is mainly motivated by a response to difficult feelings, or it's a compulsive response. It is a way to numb or to avoid or to escape, and that can be very different from the way that most people engage in sexual behaviors. So some characteristics that you might see is compulsive or excessive masturbation. This is to be distinguished from common masturbation, where many people might, engage in this behavior. That's different than when somebody feels it's compulsive, or that they're having to do it several times a day just to get through the day. Simultaneous or repeated sequential affairs, excessive use of pornography, cybersex or phone sex, multiple anonymous partners, and also victimizing behaviors. So the profile of a sex addict would include unable to form close relationships, unable to accept real intimacy because of shame and unworthiness. They will suffer from loneliness. They will also often have a sense of leading a double life. Sometimes people could appear very religious or family oriented, but have a secret sexual life. I've seen that many times with the sexual addiction, that often the people will kind of have a double life. Also, in a study by Carnes, 42 of the respondents also had problems with drugs and alcohol. So sometimes these things will be going on at the same time. Also, in a Carnes study, 90% of the participants who would be classified as sexual addicts reported acting against personal values. 88% reported feeling like two different people. 83% reported feeling emotionally exhausted. 82% reported strong fear about their own future, and 78% reported emotional instability. So we see that many of them have very common views about these things, and most people agree that these things are problems for them. So often they will suffer from impaired thinking. So first will be denial, right? They won't be recognizing that this is a problem. Often with clients that I've had pornography issues, they'll be in denial about how often they do it, how much they need to do it in order to feel normal. So often they're in denial that it actually is a problem. They often convince themselves that they can stop at any time and that they don't really do it as often as they think. And that it's not a problem. Rationalization, right? They will make arguments, excuses, circular thinking, sincere delusion. They believe their own lies about the behaviors and believe their own justifications or rationalizations. Also, they will often blame other people. They won't accept responsibility for their own mistakes, failures, or actions. So Carnes came up with this cycle of conformity where he said that often the sexual addicts will first have a preoccupation with sexual thoughts and fantasy. So they'll be constantly thinking about that. And then there'll be ritualization. So that's where the addict starts to kind of build a routine in order to intensify the experience or stimulation. And then sexual compulsion. So they're acting based on specific needs. And then the feeling of despair, which is the realization that the acting out does not lead to sexual satisfaction, but will often lead to depression, hopelessness, lack of control. But it's still not stopping the addictive behavior, still engaging, because they still feel that compulsion, that drive to do the behaviors in order to feel satisfaction, but they can never really get it. And so they're stuck in this cycle of constantly seeking out a high that may not come. Here we see an image of what the cycle might look like, right? First starting off with preoccupation, leading to ritualization, compulsive sexual behavior, despair, and then the despair will then again lead into the preoccupation, right? When they're feeling bad, then they're going to start thinking about what can make them feel better and lead again into thinking about engaging in the behaviors and then finally engaging in the behaviors. So the consequences of sex addiction, there are several. We're going to start off with emotional. Some might have experienced near-death experiences. This might be because of the risky behaviors. A lot of them will have had abortions, whether that was because they impregnated someone and that person's getting an abortion. And there can be grief over an abortion even if you're male, but there will be grief over abortions, also unwanted pregnancies. All these create some emotional consequences for the person. Social consequences would be that they might lose their partner or spouse, loss of job or being productive on the job, severe relationship problems. Obviously, if it's discovered that there have been affairs or any kind of sexual behaviors that were not within the marriage or not okay within the marriage, obviously that would cause, severe problems. Also financial problems, which could be job loss, that could be spending money on different kind of programming or on prostitutes, right? This will lead to financial issues as well. Physical, right? The person could contract AIDS or STDs, right? 65% are contracting STDs. They might pursue behaviors to the point of exhaustion. So that could be a physical consequence. Also physical injury, 38%. I've actually been surprised how much I've come across this, but it's also fairly common for people to have like penile fractures, which is a broken penis. That can happen just because often the people who are sexually addicted, they will be engaged in rigorous sex to the point that they will injure themselves. I mean, that would be a difference, right? People who are not sexual addicts would be more aware of any pain as it was occurring and would not be engaging in sexual behaviors until the point that they would be physically injured, especially physically injuring their genitalia. So this actually isn't, crazy. I've seen it in my own practice. So I imagine that, 38% is a fair amount of people who get injured. There are legal consequences. Some might get arrested, right, because they're engaging in, that could be viewing porn, such as child porn. That could be, being voyeuristic. It could be engaging with prostitutes. There's several different, things that people might be arrested for. And they also might lose rights to their children based on, some of their behaviors. It might not be safe. They might be engaging in sexual acts in front of children, so not necessarily abusing children or victimizing people, but the fact that they can't not engage in their sexual behaviors, that they might be so compulsive that they are unaware or not caring enough to be aware of who might be around or viewing what may be happening. And that was in 1991. So now that we have the internet, be aware that these statistics could be very different now. The internet has made it more easy to engage in sexual behaviors, and it does make it easier for anybody who is a sexual addict to continue to engage in these types of behaviors. And so these statistics will probably most likely be higher than they were before. So sexual addiction and obsession. So the addictive obsession can exist in whatever generates significant mood alteration, whether it is the self-nurturing of food, the excitement of gambling, or the arousal of the seduction. By focusing on chemical addictions, we have missed the significance of being able to get high on our own brain chemicals. So this is really important for us all to be aware of in terms of process addictions. So many times we focused on, drugs and alcohol, but honestly, the brain can take multiple types of behaviors, such as, we've talked about eating disorders, gambling, food, like food addiction, right? Being addicted to eating food, so maybe overeating or binge eating, shopping. There's so many ways that our brain can, in a way, change as a way of getting high on its own chemicals, and sexual addiction is one of those, right? It's a normal behavior that can be corrupted in a way so that it becomes addictive to our brains. So here are some questions, and there's quite a few, so I'm going to read them off, but these are some assessment questions that you might ask if you were maybe counseling with somebody, or these might be something that you could ask yourself, or, a loved one. You might be thinking, I think my wife or maybe my boyfriend might have issues with this, and so these might be able to help you identify if this is an addiction. Do you keep secrets about your sexual or romantic activities from those important to you? Do you lead a double life? Have your needs driven you to have sex in places or situations or with people you would not normally have chosen? Do you find yourself looking for sexually arousing articles or scenes in newspapers, magazines, or other social media? Do you find that romantic or sexual fantasies interfere with your relationships or are preventing you from facing problems? Do you frequently feel remorse, shame, or guilt after a sexual encounter? Do you feel shame about your body or your sexuality such that you avoid touching your body or engaging in sexual relationships? Do you feel that you have no sexual feelings or that you are asexual? Does each new relationship continue to have the same destructive patterns which prompted you to leave the last relationship? Do your sexual activities include the risk, threat, or reality of disease, pregnancy, coercion, or violence? Is it taking more variety and frequency of sexual activities than previously to bring the same levels of excitement and relief? Have you ever been arrested or at risk of being caught because of your practices of voyeurism, exhibition, prostitution, indecent phone calls, etc.? Does your pursuit of sexual relationships interfere with your spiritual beliefs or development? Has your sexual or romantic behavior left you feeling hopeless, alienated from others, or suicidal? Those were some questions that you can ask just to kind of assess whether someone might have a sexual addiction. We're going to now talk about partners of sex addicts and how the sexual addiction may impact them, and also how they might contribute to the sexual addiction. So often the partner will consider himself or herself a victim. Often the partner has enabled the behavior, maybe unknowingly or maybe knowingly. Carnes has 9 traits of the co-addict or the partner of a sex addict, and these are just things that he noticed that they were doing. So one is that they're covering up for the sexual addict, so maybe keeping secrets. Also an obsessive preoccupation about the sexual addict, denial of the reality or ignoring the problem, emotional turmoil, Manipulation, using sex to control their partner. Excessive responsibility, blaming themselves for the problem, right? So maybe blaming, oh, I didn't give enough sex, that's why my partner has a sexual addiction. So they might blame themselves for the addiction. Compromise or loss of self, so they will make a constant series of compromises and basically erode one's sense of self. Blame and punishment, so they might become self-righteous and punitive to the sexual addict. Also, they might be sexually reactive, might shut down sexually, might be numbing their own sexual needs. So often you might see that people that pair up together, so you might see somebody who has a history of abuse, sexual abuse. So you might find a woman who's been sexually abused, who doesn't really want to engage in sex, and she might pair up with somebody who has a sexual addiction, who often does not look to their primary relationship for sex, right? Because they're kind of involved in this ritualistic behavior, they're looking for a constant high, and so they're not really looking to engage emotionally and sexually with the same person, because sex has become a drug rather than a function of expressing love or care or sharing. And so these people might get paired because to some degree the relationship works. They both don't have to engage in emotional intimacy with sex. And so often you'll see these people pair up, and that these might be some of the traits that you might see in the co-addict. Also, we'll see that the co-addict has some certain core beliefs that characterize them. I'm not a worthwhile person. No one would love me for myself. I can control other people's behaviors, and sex is the most important sign of love. So these were themes that appeared again and again for people who are with a sex addict. I want to take a minute to discuss the family of origin of someone who might have a sexual addiction, just so you have an idea of what the family dynamics are for someone who later formed a sexual addiction. So often the addict was abused or neglected in childhood. So 83% report having been sexually abused as children. So that's a pretty high rate. Often I find that when I have met with people who have a sexual addiction or even a pornography addiction, sometimes they will not classify it as abuse at first. They would not see that, but often they've been exposed to pornography or sexual acts at a very young age, and so they may not view it as sexual abuse, or there might have been touching among neighborhood friends. And so often they'll just say, oh, that's kids just playing, and they'll say, this is normal, right? But often the more questions you ask to get more specific, the more it becomes apparent that the person is just not aware of maybe how unique their sexual exposure is, because for them, it seems just part of the norm, right? If they're engaging in lots of different sexual behaviors, they don't have as great of a barometer for distinguishing what is normal and what's not normal sexual behavior. So often I find that they have had early exposure to sexual behaviors, whether that be through, pornography or some kind of media, or, maybe some touching and maybe some direct sexual abuse, or just sexual interaction at a very young age with, peers. They often will confuse sex with nurturing. Also, in Carnes' study, he found that significant predictive relationship between the frequency of sexual and physical abuse in childhood and the number of reported types of compulsive behaviors in adulthood. So what this means is the more sexual abuse or physical abuse that happened when the child was young, the more likely they were to engage in these compulsive sexual behaviors, right? So the more serious the abuse as a child, the more serious the addiction as a behavior. And that's true, for all compulsions in adulthood. Also, one thing that was noted was that there was a rigid, disengaged family. So what this means is that the rules are going to be inflexible, but then there's also insufficient nurturing. So we've got really strict rules, a really certain way you need to be, but then there's also a lack of nurturing. And so an example might be the rigidly religious family. And I've seen that a lot in my practice, where there can be a lot of shame for any kind of sexual feelings, and so often it builds this kind of wall of secrecy around any sexuality, which kind of drives that person even more to engage in the behaviors in secrecy, versus being able to have an open dialogue about sexuality and how that develops, and the boundaries with which in sexuality should be expressed. Often it feels very black and white, right? They have to repress it, and so often the response to that repression and shame can often be escalation of sexual behaviors. Also, they will often find that there might be a multi-generational history, so maybe a series of affairs throughout the family, substance abuse, sexual addiction, eating disorders, pathological gambling, but often we'll find that there's been addiction in other parts of the family if we go back and kind of look at behaviors of other people in the family. Partners of sexual addicts often come from family backgrounds with similar dynamics. So often they might have been sexually abused. Sex, again, is the most important sign of love. And they'll also often have disorders of sexual desire, arousal, or orgasm. All right, now we're going to talk about love addiction. Love addiction is not to be confused with sex addiction. They have very different characteristics and meanings. So it is characterized as involving a preoccupation with an unhealthy relationship or dependence upon another individual, in addition to also having difficulty obtaining emotional intimacy with others. And it's difficult to assess, and there's no specific DSM diagnosis. So let's talk about the types of love addicts. There's the codependent love addict, and this person is addicted to the partner, and they try to hold on to that partner using your typical codependent behaviors. So you can reflect back on our lecture before about codependency, and they're going to be using those behaviors to keep that partner around. Relationship addicts, they're no longer in love with the person that they're in a relationship with, but they stay with the partner because they fear being alone. So they stay in relationships regardless of whether or not they want to be there because the fear of being alone is so strong. A narcissistic love addict is someone who appears to be aloof, and you probably wouldn't characterize them as addicted. They usually are going to use seduction, dominance, and withholding to keep their partner around. But often when the partner tries to leave, right, the partner might try to leave because they feel like, this person, is always controlling me, or they're withholding love. But when they try to leave, that's when they begin to realize that this partner has a love addiction. They panic a lot when the partner finally tries to leave, even though they may appear kind of aloof inside the relationship. There's also ambivalent love addicts. So there's 4 subgroups under this. There's the torchbearers, which will obsess for someone over years. This is the unrequited love. Saboteurs, who they're avoidant, they sabotage relationships when they get too serious. And so I want to distinguish this from the seductive withholders, because the saboteur is going to break up one time, right? So once a relationship gets to a point of intimacy, they're out of there. So they would probably engage in a series of relationships, and once it begins to feel threatening emotionally, they'll leave. They're avoidant of any emotional intimacy. Seductive withholders are going to run hot and cold. So they have a pattern of being available and unavailable. So often they will, get close to intimacy and then run away. And then they'll build up the intimacy even more and then run away. And so it's kind of like this tease of a relationship where they're always, on and then they're off again. Romance addicts are avoidant but addicted to multiple partners. So they will feel romance for each partner. So they might be considered what to be womanizers, right? So it's not that they're avoidant or appearingly emotionally not present. They would appear to be very in love, romanticizing the relationships, but they're doing it with several people to avoid real intimacy. So by engaging with multiple people, they kind of spread out their vulnerability rather than being vulnerable with one person. So characteristics of a love addict, they will lower their standards when they're feeling lonely. So whoever they would engage with as a partner, they will lower their standards for partners when they feel lonely. They will feel overwhelmed with loneliness when not in a relationship. They will get in a relationship to avoid feeling lonely. They will often feel inadequate when they're not in a relationship. They will often get involved with people who are not able to commit, right? So this might be somebody who is like a serial mistress, right? Like maybe I get in relationships where most likely the person will not leave their spouse. That might be an example of that. They also will be focused on becoming what the partner wants rather than just becoming who they want to be. Some other characteristics: suicidal thoughts because of failed relationships. They will be willing to suffer through neglect, depression, loneliness, dishonesty, and even abuse to avoid separation. They might have more than one ongoing romance. They will also be possessive and jealous, and they will also neglect family and friends for a partner. So some consequences of love addiction is that they will feel that despair when they're alone, a lot of depression, suicidality. They'll lose friends and families due to neglecting those relationships in order to preserve their romantic relationship. They might experience exhaustion or lack of sleep. And they also might get arrested for stalking or keying cars, restraining orders, right? This addiction can lead to stalking behaviors. So the love addict also tends to exaggerate traditional gender roles. The female should need a partner. Everything should be done with a partner. The male should be needed and take care of the partner completely. Life is nothing without a relationship. So they use these gender roles to perpetuate the relationship and to feel needed and also to justify or rationalize their neediness. So I'm sure you all know the famous line from Jerry Maguire, "You complete me," right? Often we feel like this is so romantic and we might think that's how a relationship should feel, but I think that there's a line there where somebody might feel romance and feel desire and feel love for somebody and feeling like I'm not a complete person without you and I can't function without you. There's a difference there. And so it's important to distinguish, a healthy desire for intimacy and what is love addiction. So the roots of love addiction, Brenda Schaefer notes that many roots of love addiction are planted in an individual's upbringing and family life. So, looking at how our experiences as children and young adults affect the way we see healthy versus non-healthy relationships. So I encourage you to ask about yourself and about your own relationship. Do I need this relationship or do I want this relationship? How will I cope if this relationship were to end? This is an important part of distinguishing between the healthy and unhealthy relationships. I think often people will feel, I do want this relationship and I need this relationship. We do need other people. But most in healthy relationships, if the relationship were to end, you wouldn't become suicidal, you wouldn't become so depressed that you wouldn't be able to go to work or not function, or you wouldn't necessarily jump into a relationship with someone who is clearly not something you would normally choose, right? So thinking about how you would cope if the relationship ended, I think would be a more clear indicator of how healthy you are in terms of codependency or love addiction. Because most of us probably feel like we want and we need our partner, but most of us would be able to cope with the loss of that partner and move on and live a meaningful life, even though we might be grieving the loss of that relationship. So that concludes the lecture for today, and I hope that was helpful in helping you to see, what sex addiction looks like, what love addiction looks like, how they're different, and how this might be different from healthy sexual behavior and also healthy behavior within relationships. Thank you for listening.